Hi, my name's Mark. I handle innovation here at Wild Rose Brewery. And if you're not familiar with the history of our company, I'm going to give you a quick history lesson and then we're going to run through a guided tasting for a few of our key brands. We were founded back in 1996 in Calgary by a couple of friends named Mike and Al, who were big beer fans, and they were a little disappointed with the amount of options that were available to drinkers at the time. We started off in a small industrial park bay out in the southeast end of town, basically just a glorified garage, and for the first decade or so, it was a pretty tough slog because the craft beer hadn't really taken off in Canada and Calgary, so consumers were a little wary. In 2006, we moved to the building you're currently looking at right now. We call this AF23, and it's located at the Currie Barracks in southwest Calgary. People sometimes ask, what does AF23 mean? And it's not just some number we made up, because this building is actually a decommissioned Canadian Forces Air Force hangar dating back to right before the Second World War. And so AF23 was actually the Air Force number 23 designation for this building. That's the sign that was on the front of the building when we moved in, so we took it off and hung it up above the bar for the sake of history. In 2000, that was about the time that craft beer really started to take off in Calgary specifically and in Canada and broader trends. And then we've experienced a ton of growth since that point. In 2011, we opened up another dedicated production facility way out in the southeast end of Calgary, so kind of returning to our roots out in that part of town. And ever since then, it's been consistent growth year over year over year. And that brings us to the present day. We're going to start off with our Velvet Fog. We call this one a Canadian wheat ale, and even though that isn't a traditionally recognized style of beer, we call it that because it doesn't really fit into any pre-existing categories. It's not quite hoppy enough to be an American-style wheat ale, and it doesn't have any of the big spicy characteristics that are normally associated with European-style wheat ales. The first thing you're going to notice about the Velvet Fog is that it's a hazy beer. It is unfiltered. And in a lot of cases, choosing whether or not to filter a beer is a purely cosmetic choice, but that is not the case with this beer, because the haze you're looking at is residual proteins from the grain used in the brewing process, and also live yeast cells in suspension. And that's a big, big part of what makes this beer what it is. It's not entirely made with wheat. It's got about half wheat and half barley. And if you give it a bit of a sniff, you'll notice you get notes of freshly baked bread from the grain, and you'll also notice a slight hint of citrus. A little bit of that's from the hops, but a little bit of that is actually from the yeast that's still in suspension. You might even get notes of maybe kind of yogurt as well. That's also from the yeast. And if the yeast wasn't in there, if this was a filtered beer, this just would not have the same characteristics. This would be a very lifeless beer without that haze to it. If you give it a sip, you'll notice it's got lots of body in your mouth, and it's nice and smooth and silky. And again, that's coming from the haze, that's coming from the residual protein and the yeast. And if that wasn't there, this beer just would not have the same character. Next up, we're going to pour ourselves a glass of our Electric Avenue. Our idea with the Electric Avenue was to produce a beer that could be enjoyed by people who may not be veterans of the craft beer scene, who don't normally drink craft beer, but people with more advanced craft beer palates would still be able to enjoy it as well. It's a lot lighter than what a lot of people associate with craft beer, but the thing about a beer like this is this kind of beer is actually a lot harder to make than most of the big, bold styles, because with a beer like this, you want something very light and drinkable, and any mistake you make is really going to stick out in the end product because it doesn't have any of those big hop or big malt flavors to cover up any mistakes in process that you make. This is a blonde ale. You'll notice a bit of a more hop characteristic than the Velvet Fog, but still not a ton. It's still very restrained because the idea with this beer was, like I said, something to give to your uncle who normally drinks, corporate beer. Very nice, very refreshing, very clean finish. In the industry, we sometimes call these lawnmower beers because they're the perfect beer to drink while you're mowing your lawn in the summer or at the beach, camping, on the patio. It's a great, just all-around, all-purpose beer. It's great for a barbecue, you name it. Next up, we're gonna take a look at our legendary raspberry ale. Like the Electric Ave, our raspberry ale is a filtered beer. If you hold it up to the light, you'll notice the way the light bounces through it looks really nice. You'll also notice a slight pink tint to it, and that's not from any artificial coloring. That is just from the actual real raspberries we use in this beer. You hold it up to your nose and get a little sniff. You'll also notice great big natural aroma flavor. Again, no artificial aromas. You'll notice a real nice natural raspberry flavor that really complements the hops and the yeast. And people will often comment to us that they like our raspberry ale, but they don't normally like other fruit beers. The thing is, that's because we set out to make a beer with raspberry where all the flavors complemented each other. We did not set out to make an alcoholic soda or a beer that tasted like it had a bunch of artificial flavoring dumped into it. It's got a real nice, clean, crisp flavor, finishes really clean on the palate. This is a really nice all-purpose beer too. And if you're one of those people who looks at a fruit beer and thinks that maybe it's not for you, give it a shot. Maybe it'll change your mind. Next up, we're going to take a look at our High Harvest. Out of all the beers we're looking at today, the High Harvest is the most recent addition to our lineup. And it's actually a pretty recent style too. This is what's called an East Coast IPA. And it has a lot of similarities with a traditional West Coast IPA, but there's a bunch of noted differences as well. The main one is obvious. This is an unfiltered beer. It's even cloudier than the Velvet Fog. And even though West Coast IPAs aren't necessarily always filtered, they definitely aim for those beers to be as clear as possible. This is the exact opposite. We actually add big bags of hemp seed flour to the boil on this one to add protein, to add haze, to add body, because that's a trademark of this style. We want it to have big body like orange juice, like grapefruit juice. And if you smell it, you give a note. You'll notice lots of grapefruit, even like tangerine, orange, hints of lemon, lots of great big citrus aroma. And it doesn't have the same mouth-coating, sticky bitterness that is normally associated with West Coast IPAs. So a lot of people who think they don't like IPAs, actually this has been bringing them around. So if you're one of those people, maybe give this a shot. See it, maybe you'll like it. Next in line, we have our traditional West Coast IPA, the Industrial Park Ale. We call this our Industrial Park Ale to pay homage to our first location out in the Southeast Industrial Park, and I talked about it at the beginning. And unlike the High Harvest, you'll notice that this is a filtered beer. If you're not familiar with the story of IPAs, the term stands for India Pale Ale, and it dates back to the 18th century when brewers in England made beers with higher alcohol content and more hops so that they would better stand the journey from England all the way around the Horn of Africa to the colonies in India. But there's not a lot of similarities between those beers and modern IPAs, because modern IPAs aren't meant to, sit on a boat for 4 months. They're meant to be drank fresh. Unlike the High Harvest, you'll notice that citrus is there, but it's also got a big accompaniment of kind of a pine kind of characteristic, which is a big hallmark of this style. And that's Citra, Apollo, and Cascade are the main hops used in this. And Cascade is a big prominent hop in this style of beer. And personally, I think you can't really make this style of beer without Cascade. You'll also notice that even though it is clean, it's very refreshing, it does have a certain syrupy and stickiness that coats your mouth, and it does linger, so that's to be expected with this style of beer. Finally, we're going to take a look at our Barracks Brown. This is actually the first beer that Wild Rose ever made, but back then we just called it Brown Ale. The whole Barracks Brown name is just a way of paying homage to the Curry Barracks where our tap room is currently located. Even though this is a very dark beer, it is a filtered beer, so if you hold it up to the light, you'll notice some really nice colors as the light bounces through it. You'll notice some dark browns, oranges, ambers, even some red hues. Looks fantastic. And that all comes from the different types of malt we use in this. That color is from grain that has been roasted, really similar to the way they roast coffee beans. And there are hundreds of different varieties of roasted malt. We use a combination of 4 different varieties to get the color, the aroma, and the flavor characteristics we're looking for on this. On the nose, you'll notice big notes of coffee and a little touch of maybe even baker's chocolate. It's a little bit less carbonated than our other beers, which is accurate to this style. And you'll notice that even though it's a very dark beer, unlike something like a stout, it's not a super heavy beer, so it still goes down very smooth and isn't super filling. It's got a lot of character though. It's got like the roasty notes. There's even a little touch of malted oats in this one as well. That brings us to the end of our tasting program. I hope you had a good time and maybe learned something you didn't already know. On behalf of everyone here at Wild Rose, I'd like to issue a sincere thank you for supporting us all these years, and you can check us out on our website and come down and visit us at the tap room anytime you're in the neighborhood.